All right, let's dive into something that'll really bend your brain. Today, we are digging into this incredible philosophical argument from the 1800s, one that tries to prove God exists by arguing that he can't be proven. Yeah, I know, it sounds like a total riddle, but it's this really deep piece of thinking that just flips the whole idea of proof completely on its head.
Just let that sink in for a second. It's the perfect paradox, right? And it's the absolute core of this amazing argument from way back in 1877. This one sentence is basically our key to unlocking a pretty dense, pretty challenging, but wow, a really rewarding piece of philosophy. So let's see how he actually builds this case. So who would even dare to make a claim that sounds so contradictory? We need to meet the man behind the argument and understand the massive project he set for himself.
Our guide on this journey is Elijah Benamozegh. He's a philosopher and a rabbi living in Livorno, Italy, right in the middle of this huge upheaval of science and new ideas. You know, he saw this growing gap between the world of faith and the modern world of reason, and he basically decided, okay, I'm going to take on the challenge of building a bridge between them. Now, Benamozegh was working in a field called theodicy, and usually theodicy is all about tackling that one super tough question. If God is good, why is there so much evil and suffering? Benamozegh definitely touches on that, but his goal is even bigger. He's trying to defend the very idea of faith itself, but using the other side's tools, logic and reason. He actually called his own project a Herculean task, which, yeah, sounds about right. His goal was huge, to show that these ancient religious truths could totally hold their own against the tough questions from modern science and philosophy. He wasn't just writing for people who already believed. He was aiming squarely at the skeptic, the scientist, the modern thinker.
So to start this massive undertaking, Benamozegh doesn't begin with some abstract formula. Nope. He starts with something we can all see: history. His first line of attack is what he calls a positive argument, and the claim is that the evidence for God is basically written all over the story of humanity, like a fingerprint.
And to drive this point home, he pulls out this quote from the ancient historian Plutarch. Think about that. It's a really powerful observation. You can find societies that lack things we think are essential, walls for protection, written laws, money, but you will never, ever find one that doesn't have some concept of the divine. For Benamozegh, that's no accident. That's a major clue.
So he builds this case by pointing to this universal thing across all of humanity. I mean, from the very roots of our oldest languages to what we dig up from prehistoric sites, the signs of religious belief are just everywhere. He even slips the script on paganism. He doesn't see it as a contradiction, but as a kind of foggy, distorted memory of an original, single truth. So for him, this consensus across all people everywhere throughout time, that's not just a cultural habit. That's proof. But, of course, Benamozegh was no fool. He knew this line of reasoning had some classic counter-arguments. So he actually anticipates what the skeptics are going to say, and he takes them on, one by one. It's like a philosophical showdown right there on the page. Okay, so the first skeptic's claim is one we've all heard a million times. Religion comes from fear, right? Early humans were terrified of lightning, of earthquakes, so they made up gods to explain these scary things. But Benamozegh just completely flips this. He argues that if you actually look at the oldest stories, the oldest names for God, they're overwhelmingly positive. They're linked to light, to goodness, to beauty. He says the good, kind gods came first. It wasn't fear that sparked faith. It was gratitude and a sense of awe. All right, next claim. Religion is just a political trick, a tool made up by smart kings and rulers to keep the population under control. And again, Benamozegh just reverses the logic. He points out that we find religious rituals in human societies way, way before we find complex governments or kings. So he says you've got it backwards. Religion wasn't a tool of social order, it was the very source of social order. It gave people the shared beliefs that made society possible to begin with. Now we get to the really philosophical objection, this one from a thinker named Ludwig Feuerbach. The claim is that God is basically just an illusion, a projection. We humans take all our best qualities, wisdom, justice, love,
and we create an idealized, perfect version of ourselves and project it onto some imaginary being up in the sky. But Benamozegh's comeback here is honestly brilliant. He asks a simple question. Where did our finite, imperfect, limited minds even get the idea of perfect in the first place? The very fact that we can even think of an infinite, perfect being suggests that this idea didn't just come from inside us. It's a reflection of something real, something external. And this brings us right back to where we started. It brings us to the ultimate paradox. Because after he defends all this historical evidence, Benamozegh delivers his final, most powerful, and most, well, counterintuitive point of all. He quotes this medieval philosopher, Solomon ibn Gabirol, who paints this picture of people searching for God as blind men, all stumbling around in different directions. One falls in a pit, another in a ditch. Everyone's trying to get to the same place, but they're all kind of lost. This image perfectly sets up his final, crucial insight about what proof really means. And here it is. This is the heart of the whole thing. It's a fundamental mismatch. How can a finite, limited human mind, our mind, ever hope to completely prove or fully grasp a being that is, by its very definition, infinite and unlimited? It's a logical impossibility. Any proof our little minds could cook up would have to be smaller than the thing it's trying to prove. And this stunning analogy from his text says it all. It just nails it. If you could hold the entire ocean in the palm of your hand, it wouldn't mean your hand is huge. It would only mean the ocean is shockingly small. And in the exact same way, if we could create a perfect, logical, airtight proof of God's existence, it wouldn't prove that God is great. It would only prove that God was small enough to fit inside our human reason. So our very inability to prove him becomes the most compelling evidence there is for his infinite nature, which really leaves us with this final, massive question to chew on. Benamozegh's argument seems to suggest that maybe the human condition, our inability to ever find a final, concrete answer, combined with this universal, unstoppable instinct to keep looking for one, maybe that is the most profound evidence we're ever going to get. Maybe the search itself is the destination. Thanks for joining The Explainer. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle one of the most powerful and, honestly, personal arguments ever conceived. One that takes place entirely inside your own mind. Yeah, you heard that right. So you can forget about looking through telescopes or digging through ancient texts for a minute. The proof we're exploring today, it starts with something you already have. It's that simple, undeniable experience of your own consciousness. So, what we're talking about here is known as the ontological argument. And what's so cool about it is that it's a proof that unfolds not from faith, but from pure reason. The version we're digging into today really frames it as a journey of self-discovery. It all starts with the data you find right inside your own head. Okay, let's dive in. All right, so the whole argument really kicks off with this first kind of unavoidable fact of our inner lives. We exist, but we're also really aware that we're flawed, We're limited and we're incomplete. I mean, just think about it for a second. We know we're temporary, right? We change, we grow, we mess up. And it's that very awareness, our knowledge that we are finite, that immediately forces our minds to create a contrast, to conceive of its total opposite, something eternal, something infinite, something perfect. And this right here, this leads to a really fascinating philosophical problem. I mean, if everything you had ever known or experienced was imperfect, how could you possibly know it was imperfect? It's like, to even recognize that a line is crooked, you have to have some idea of what straight is in the first place. This is exactly the puzzle that the great philosopher René Descartes wrestled with. He basically concluded that this idea he had of a perfect being, there's no way it could have just come from his own mind. Why? Because he knew his own mind was imperfect. The logic here is surprisingly simple. An imperfect source just can't invent a truly perfect idea. And boom, that's the first major pillar of this argument. The idea is that our awareness of our own limits, it's not just some psychological quirk. No.
It's presented as a kind of logical signpost, one that points directly toward a perfect standard that has to exist somewhere outside of ourselves. Okay, so that's our inner world pointing toward perfection. But what about the world outside of us? Well, the second pillar of this argument also kicks off with a really simple, everyday observation. Okay, so check out this logic. Step 1. We look around and we see that pretty much everything that exists has a cause, right? Step 2. This creates a huge chain of causes and effects stretching way, way back. But, and this is step 3, that chain can't logically just go on forever and ever into the past. It just can't. So, step 4, there has to be a single uncaused first cause that got the whole shebang started. Think about it like a real physical chain. Imagine countless links, and each one is being held up by the one above it. Well, what happens if there's no first top link? No anchor holding everything up? The whole thing just collapses into a pile, right? Logically, you have to get to a first link that isn't held up by anything else, a cause that itself was never caused. That's the only way for the entire chain of reality to hold together.
And philosophers have a pretty cool name for this uncaused first cause. They call it a necessary being. Now, what does that mean? It means it's a being that has to exist, just by its own nature. It doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. In fact, everything else depends on it.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. The argument takes a pretty surprising turn. It connects these purely philosophical ideas we've been talking about to concepts from Jewish mysticism, and the parallel it's pretty remarkable.
Okay, let's walk through this together because how this all connects is really powerful. So on the left, you've got our basic psychological experiences, right? Our awareness of just being. That's the first one. That inner feeling leads us to that philosophical conclusion of a necessary being. And here's the link. In Jewish mystical tradition, that maps directly to the divine name Ahi, which means I am. See the connection? Now let's look at the next row. Our awareness of thought and how it's imperfect. That points us to the idea of a perfect being. Theologically, that corresponds to the name Yah, a name for God signifying perfection. And finally, our awareness of activity in the world, cause and effect, that leads us to the first cause. And this is reflected in the name Elohim, which is tied to causality and power. It's this incredible direct line from our inner experience to a philosophical concept, to an ancient theological name that makes this take on the argument so unique. So after this whole journey, from deep introspection to pure logic, and even into theology, where does that leave us? Let's bring this all together and land on the final conclusion.
When you boil it all down, this isn't an argument that asks you to look for external evidence. The entire case is built on rational introspection. It's really about following the logical trail that starts with the simple, undeniable fact that you exist and you can think about your own existence.
And it's really important to get this next part. The argument isn't proposing 3 different gods or 3 different beings. Not at all. Instead, what it's suggesting is that these 3 totally distinct lines of reasoning, the one from our imperfection, the one from causality, and the one from our own sense of activity, they all converge. They all point to a single source that embodies all 3 of these qualities at once.
All of this powerfully echoes the most famous version of this argument, which comes from St. Anselm. His definition of God was simple but profound. That than which nothing greater can be conceived. And his point was, if you can truly conceive of such a perfect being, then it must exist in reality. His logic? Well, a being that actually exists in reality is obviously greater than a being that exists only as an idea inside your head. Now, I have to say, this is one of the most famously debated points in all of philosophy. Critics, both back then and today, basically argue that you can't just define something into existence. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, argued that existence isn't a property like blue or heavy that you can just add to a concept to make it greater.
And so that is the really provocative question that this whole argument leaves us chewing on. Is the idea of God completely unique? Is it the one concept that, if you can truly and fully grasp it, logically demands its own existence? A thought that might just contain its own reality.
All right, let's jump right in.
For centuries, some of the greatest thinkers have been locked in this huge intellectual showdown, and it's all centered on one single, massive question, a question that really gets to the heart of what reality even is.
Just think about that for a moment. I mean, really think. What is the one foundational thing that everything else, the sun, the earth, the laws of nature, even your own thoughts, what does it all rely on to exist? What's the bedrock of it all?
You know, this isn't just some dusty old debate for a philosophy class. The answer actually shapes how we see everything, from science to our own purpose in the cosmos. And this ultimate, foundational reality, it has a name. Philosophers call it the absolute.
So let's be clear on the rules of the game here. The absolute, or hamuchlat in Hebrew, as you can see there, it has to be three things. It has to be foundational, meaning everything else springs from it. It has to be necessary, meaning it has to exist. It's not optional. And it's got to be ultimate. There's nothing bigger or more fundamental. So, with that definition in mind, let's bring in the challengers. First up in the ring, we've got the subjective self. This is the idea that maybe, just maybe, the ultimate reality isn't out there somewhere, but right inside your own head.
The philosopher Fichte was a big champion of this. The claim is pretty bold. The thinking I, your consciousness, is the absolute. Everything you perceive, the whole universe, is basically a product of your mind. But there's a pretty glaring problem with this idea, which our source material is quick to point out. And here's the problem. If my mind is creating all of reality, how on earth can I learn about geology or astronomy? How can my mind invent a world with a history that stretches back billions of years, long before my mind or any human mind ever existed? It just doesn't add up.
The source text really nails it with this quote. The idea that your mind is making up evidence of a past that happened before you were even here, well, that's called the peak of fantasy and paradox. It's a total contradiction.
And here's the final nail in the coffin for this idea. Think about your own consciousness, your I. It changes constantly, right? You learn things, you forget things, you feel happy, then sad. It's limited. But the absolute, by its very definition, has to be infinite and unchanging. A limited, flickering I just doesn't sit the bill. So challenger number 1 is down for the count. So if reality isn't all in our heads, let's swing to the complete opposite idea. Maybe the only thing that's truly real is the physical stuff around us, the material world. This brings us to challenger number 2, materialism. The materialist playbook is pretty simple. The absolute is the not I. It's the external, physical universe made of matter and energy. This, they say, is the one necessary, indestructible thing. It seems solid, right? I mean, you can touch it. But according to our source, this idea starts to crack once you look a little closer. The author's critique really breaks down into 3 key points. First, the material world isn't logically necessary. You can totally imagine a universe not existing, and it doesn't create a logical contradiction. Second, it's definitely not unchanging. The universe is defined by constant, violent change. And third, and this is a big one, thought seems to be on a higher level than matter. Your mind can have an idea of the universe, but the universe can't have an idea of your mind. It seems impossible for the greater thing, consciousness, to just emerge from the lesser thing, unthinking matter.
Okay, so if the absolute isn't just the mind, and it's not just matter, what if it's both? What if you combine them? This leads us straight to our third challenger, pantheism.
Great thinkers like Spinoza and Hegel pushed this idea. They said the absolute is the grand unity of everything. Thought and matter, the I and the not I, it's all one giant divine system. The universe is God, and God is the universe. And you have to admit, it's a beautiful, all-encompassing idea. But our author uses this brilliant metaphor to show us the problem. They compare pantheism to that giant statue from the Bible. You know, the one with a head of gold, arms of silver, but down at the bottom, its feet are made of weak, brittle clay. It looks magnificent from a distance, but its foundation is fundamentally flawed. So what are these feet of clay? Well, for starters, if everything is God, then you, me, this planet, every single particle, we'd all have to be our own little absolutes. That's a contradiction.
Then there's the weird idea that the absolute somehow peaks in finite human minds, which just seems absurd given the sheer size of the universe. It also gets causality backward, trying to get a perfect end result out of an imperfect starting point. And maybe the most damaging flaw, if God is always changing, always becoming, then truth itself is never stable. Science just becomes opinion. The whole thing collapses.
Okay, so after systematically knocking down all three major challengers, the author finally steps into the ring to present their own case. And it all begins by looking at one simple word in a completely new way.
That word is infinite. We usually think of it as a negative. In means not, so infinite just means not finite. But the author says, no, flip that around. Think of it as a positive idea. Infinite doesn't mean what something lacks. It describes what it is. It's the complete removal of all limitation. It is the idea of perfection itself. And this brings us to this powerhouse quote from Descartes, which is really the key to the whole argument. He's asking, how do I even know that I'm imperfect? How do I know I doubt things or that I lack knowledge? The only way I can recognize my own flaws is because somehow I already have an idea in my mind of a being that has no flaws, a perfect being. And this leads us to the grand finale, the ontological argument. It goes like this. Imagine the most perfect being possible. By definition, that being has to possess all perfections, right? Well, what's a major perfection? Real existence. A perfect being that existed only in your imagination would be less perfect than one that actually existed in reality. So if you can even conceive of a maximally perfect being, that being must exist. Its existence is a logical requirement of its perfection. So that's where we land with this one last huge question. Is this idea of a perfect, infinite being just something our limited brains cooked up? Or is the very fact that we, in our limited, imperfect state, can even have that thought, is that the ultimate clue? Is that the proof that such a being is real and is the one true absolute that underpins everything? Now that is something to chew on. All right, welcome. Today, we're diving into a really mind-bending idea. It all starts with a question that sounds so simple, you've probably never even thought to ask it. But trust me, trying to answer it changes everything.
Okay, so why does A equal A? We just know it does, right? It's a fundamental rule of the universe. Something can't be true and false at the same time. This is the absolute bedrock of all science, all math, all of our thinking. But here's the kicker. You can't actually prove it. So if the very foundation of all reason is something we have to take on faith, where does that faith come from?
Well, it turns out that all of our knowledge, every complex theory, every scientific breakthrough, it's all built on just a handful of these simple, unprovable truths. And they have a name. Axioms.
Think of an axiom as like the source code for your mind. It's the basic operating system that lets you think it all. You don't prove the code, you use the code to prove everything else. Which, just pushes the question back one step further. Who or what wrote that code?
The text we're digging into today offers this really powerful, ancient answer. It says these rules of logic aren't just random, and we didn't invent them. They are a direct reflection of a divine reality, almost like the fingerprint of God on the human mind. And here's where the parallel gets really beautiful. Just think about it for a second. The divine is described as the inner reality. It sees everything, but is itself unseen. And what about logic? Well, it's the inner law of our own minds. It illuminates all our thoughts, but you can't really turn the light back on itself to see it. Logic is the light, not the thing being lit. So in this view, the divine becomes the principle of all logic, the absolute, non-negotiable starting point. And in Hebrew, this idea is perfectly captured by the letter Aleph. The very first letter, the origin point of everything that comes after. But okay, this divine logic isn't just some static starting point that just sits there. No, it's also the very process we use to get around. It's the path we walk to make sense of the world. And we're not just talking about cold, hard calculation here. This logic is seen as flowing through every part of what it means to be human. Through our intellect, we're constantly searching for what's true. Through our will, our moral compass, we're striving for what's good.
And through our imagination and creativity, we're reaching for what's beautiful.
And get this, there's a fantastic little clue hidden in the Hebrew language that ties this all together. The word tov doesn't just mean good. It can also mean true and beautiful all at once. So this suggests that when ancient traditions called God the good, they were pointing to something way bigger, the single, ultimate source of all truth, goodness, and beauty. It's all connected.
So you see, the divine isn't just the starting point. It's also the process, the very means by which we reason our way through life. And this is symbolized by the letter mem, which sits right in the middle of the Hebrew alphabet and represents the journey, the path itself.
All right, so we've got a beginning and we've got a path. But where is this journey of logic even going? Well, the text argues it's not just a random walk. Our reasoning is always traveling toward a specific destination, a final conclusion, a sense of certainty.
You know that feeling, right, when you've been wrestling with a problem and you finally solve it, and there's that sense of arrival, of certainty, that aha moment. That's the feeling of finding the truth at the end of the journey. And the text suggests that truth was already there, waiting for you from the very beginning.
This destination, this feeling of finality, of yes, I've got it, that is the purpose of all our reasoning. And it's represented by the very last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, tav, which acts as the end of the journey, the final seal of approval. So let's put this all together. The entire journey of our reason starts with a divine principle.
It moves along a divine process.
And it drives toward a divine purpose.
Principle, aleph. Process, mem. Purpose, tav. You put those three letters together, A, M, T, and they form the Hebrew word emet, the word for truth. I mean, just let that sink in. According to this worldview, truth isn't just some concept, it's a divine journey, a beginning, a middle, and an end, written into the very structure of our mind. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That sounds like a pretty wild, out there idea. But here's the thing. It's not an isolated one. It's actually part of this incredibly powerful intellectual tradition that you can hear echoing through thousands of years of philosophy. The ancient Greeks were wrestling with the same ideas. Plato himself, drawing on even older traditions, taught this exact same structure, that the divine is the principle, the middle, and the end of absolutely everything. Then you have the philosopher, Philo of Alexandria, who brilliantly merged Greek and Hebrew thought. He argued that the divine logos, which means both word and reason, is the bridge that connects God to the world, and that it impresses its seal, its structure, onto our very minds. Let's fast forward over 1,500 years. The French philosopher Malebranche put forward this famous and pretty radical idea that our ability to even understand universal truths is because we are, in a very real sense, seeing all things in God. We're tapping into the divine mind to think. And then in the 19th century, Jules Simon distilled it down into this beautifully simple, logical argument. He said, look, if truths like 2 + 2 = 4 are eternal and true everywhere, they must exist inside a mind that is also eternal and exist everywhere. Therefore, God must exist. And really, it all boils down to this essential paradox, which the philosopher DuPont White captured perfectly. We experience these fundamental truths deep inside ourselves, yet it doesn't feel like we made them up. It feels like we discovered them. What would be true if not that which is within us without being from us? And that leaves us with a massive question for our own time. This entire line of thinking argues that for truth to be real, to be objective, it needs a divine anchor. So in a world that has largely cut that anchor loose, what do we ground our truth in now? If A = A isn't grounded in the divine, is it grounded in anything at all? Okay, so let's jump right into this. What we're doing here is basically a philosophical detective story. We're going to follow a trail of clues the author says are hiding in plain sight,
right in our everyday human experiences. You know, it all kicks off with these really fundamental questions. And the argument we're about to unpack, it suggests that all those feelings, that little voice telling you what's right, that awe you feel looking at a sunset, that drive to find the truth, they aren't just, random noise in your head. No. The idea here is that they're signposts. They're actual clues. And if you follow them logically, they all point to the very same place, a single ultimate source for all of reality. So let's follow that trail. And we're going to start with the first piece of evidence, which is something we all have, our own inner world. So our first major clue on this journey, it isn't found out there in the cosmos or in some dusty old book. Nope. It's found right inside each of us, in the simple, profound ability to make a choice. And this brings us to the first major piece of evidence, what's called the moral argument. It really starts with a simple, powerful observation. We have free will. And the core of the argument is that this one ability, the fact that we can choose, logically points us towards some kind of objective, absolute standard of what good even means. And this is where it gets really fascinating. The way our freedom is framed. It's not treated as just, another product of evolution. It's actually called a continuous miracle. The idea is that it's a constant break from the blind, deterministic laws of physics that run everything else in the universe. Okay, so here's how the logic is built step by step. 1, we have free will. 2, because we have free will, we have to make choices. It's unavoidable. 3, to make a good choice, we need some kind of standard of good to aim for, right? And then here's the kicker, the final step. That standard can't just be your opinion or my opinion. For it to mean anything, it has to be an objective, absolute good that exists completely independent of us. And this quote just nails the point. I mean, think about it for a second. Even people who do awful things almost never say, "Yep, I'm choosing to be evil today." No way. They justify it. They try to frame their actions as being good, or at least necessary or just. The argument is that this universal need to justify proves just how deeply this concept of an absolute good is baked into our brain. All right, so that's clue number 1, our moral compass. Now, the next clue in our little detective story takes us from the realm of the conscience to the realm of the heart. We're going to look at our sense of beauty and that very unique human thing we call love. So the text draws this really sharp line between animal instinct and human love. For an animal, attraction is pretty straightforward. It's a biological drive. It's functional. But human love, that's presented as something totally different. We idealize the person we love. We don't just see them for who they are. We see an ideal. It's like we're trying to find something infinite inside of another limited, finite person. And that brings us to the real heart of this argument. Human love is basically a form of worship. So when you hear lovers call each other my idol or even my God, the text says, hey, that's not just poetic fluff. It's a real expression of our deep, deep search for the absolute. It's seeing a spark of the divine in another human being. And this same logic gets applied to, well, all kinds of beauty. It doesn't matter if you're moved by a brilliant piece of art, an elegant scientific theory, or a courageous act. The idea is that it's more than just your personal taste. Each of those beautiful things is like a little broken shard of a mirror, each one reflecting a tiny, imperfect piece of one single, perfect, absolute beauty that is the source of it all. Okay, so the argument is about to take a pretty big leap now. We're moving beyond our inner world, beyond morality and beauty, and we're going to look at the nature of existence itself. And the logic here is actually pretty simple and powerful. Just picture a single wave in the ocean. That wave is temporary, right? It's finite. But its very existence proves something else. The existence of the entire ocean it came from. You can't have the wave without the ocean. It's impossible. And so, the argument goes, the exact same thing is true for us. Our own limited, temporary, finite lives, they are the proof. The simple fact that we exist, but only for a little while, is presented as direct evidence of a boundless, universal, eternal life that has to be our source. Our finite life points directly to an infinity. All right, so this is the final step in our philosophical detective story. It's time to take all of these clues we've gathered, the moral clue, the beauty clue, and the existence clue, and see how they all fit together into one big picture.
So after all this, where we ended up? Well, the final conclusion is that our hunt for truth, our gut feeling about goodness, and our deep love of beauty, they aren't three separate things. They're more like three different windows in the same room, all giving you a different view of the exact same landscape. A single, unified reality.
This quote really gets to the core of it. These three things, truth, goodness, and beauty, they're all tangled up together. Think about it. A truth that's just plain ugly or evil feels like it's missing something, doesn't it? And a good deed that's based on a total lie feels like a sham. They're all presented here as just different sides of the same coin, different facets of one single, harmonious, absolute reality, which the author calls God.
So from this viewpoint, the issue with atheism isn't that it's immoral or anything like that. No. The philosophical problem, according to this argument, is that it creates this huge disconnect. It forces you to believe that your deepest, most powerful intuitions about what's good, what's true, and what's beautiful are ultimately just meaningless illusions inside a random, pointless universe. It's this jarring clash between our inner compass and the world as it supposedly is.
And that really is the final provocative idea this text leaves us chewing on. It's asking us to consider a wild possibility. What if all those deep feelings, the very ones that guide our lives and give us a sense of meaning, what if they aren't just wishful thinking? What if they're actually the most reliable signposts we have, pointing us directly toward the fundamental nature of reality itself? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are going deep, really deep. We're exploring one of the most fundamental questions humanity has ever dared to ask. So let's just dive right in. We're tackling a question first posed thousands of years ago in the ancient Upanishads of India, and it's a big one. What is the ultimate source of reality? And how can our tiny, finite minds even begin to wrap themselves around something that might be infinite? Now, this isn't just some dusty academic puzzle, This is a real search for what philosophers call the absolute, that single fundamental principle that could explain everything else. The first domino, the final answer, the whole shebang. And what's really remarkable is just how long this search has been going on. The philosopher Ernest Renan made a great point back in the 19th century. He said, look, if religion were just a simple mistake, a total illusion, it would have vanished ages ago. The fact that it's still here points to something really, really fundamental about being human. Okay, so where do we even begin an investigation this huge? Let's start with the first clues we have, from way back in the ancient world. Did this religious impulse, this quest for the absolute, come from forces outside of us, from the world around us? Well, here's one of the oldest theories out there. Our ancient ancestors, they looked out at a world that was dangerous, totally unpredictable. I mean, you've got storms, predators, disease. Did they invent God simply out of sheer terror? And there's some real weight to this idea. The historian Alfred Maury, he noticed that a lot of early cults were all about appeasing powerful and, let's be honest, often nasty gods. He argued that things like animal sacrifice didn't come from a place of love, but from the raw terror of divine anger and a desperate hope to calm it down. But, okay, fear is a powerful motivator, for sure. But it's not the whole story. On the other side of that coin, you've got wonder. Just think about the awe that Homer's heroes felt when they thought about Oceanus, this idea of an infinite, unknowable river that was the source of all life. That feeling, that sublime sense of something vast and mysterious, that was an equally powerful drive. And this is where things get really fascinating, because it leads us to this major pivot in the whole investigation. What if the source of all this isn't out there, in the storms and the stars, but it's actually deep within the human mind itself? Right. There are thinkers, like the anthropologist Quatrefages, who argued that being religious isn't something we learn. It's an innate part of being human. It's a faculty we're literally born with, and it's what truly sets us apart from every other animal on the planet. So, how would that even work? How does a mind just create a god? Well, the philologist Max Mueller came up with this absolutely brilliant theory, and it's all about language. So it starts simple. Step 1, we perceive individual things. We see lots of trees.
Step 2, our amazing brain forms an abstract concept from that. We call it forest. But here's the magic trick. Step 3, we personify that abstract idea. We give it agency, a personality, a name, like the spirit of the forest. And boom, just like that, a deity is born, right out of grammar and thought. And language is just one piece of this internal puzzle. You've got the psychologist Wundt, who believed our unconscious mind just can't help it. It projects its own sense of cause and effect onto the universe. Other thinkers point to dreams. I mean, think about it. If you dream about someone who's passed away, maybe that's where we got the whole concept of a soul, an eidolon, or a spirit double. And maybe the biggest clue of all is our unique ability to even think about the infinite, an idea that goes so far beyond what our 5 senses can ever tell us. So we've got these 2 big camps, right? External origins versus internal origins. And once those foundations are on the table, well, the whole thing just explodes into a full-blown philosophical war, with radically different ideas about reality clashing head-on.
In one corner, you've got the metaphysicians. These are the thinkers arguing that there is a higher, unseen reality. And they came with some heavy-hitting arguments. They'd ask these huge questions like, why is there something instead of nothing, pointing to causality? They used pure logic with ontological arguments suggesting the very idea of a perfect being proves it has to exist. And they'd point to our shared moral compass as evidence of some kind of universal absolute good.
But then, a powerful new challenger steps into the ring, ready to flip the entire chessboard over. And that challenger was materialism.
Materialists like Joseph Ditskin, they did not pull their punches. They made a really stark claim. They said all these lofty ideas, God, justice, freedom, they're just smoke and mirrors. The real engine driving the world, they argued, isn't ideas. It's raw material interest. It's economics, biology, physics.
So you see this fundamental clash, right? It's 2 totally opposite ways of explaining reality. Metaphysics starts from the top down. It tries to explain the physical world, the lower, by using these higher unseen principles. Materialism does the exact opposite. It starts from the bottom up. It explains our higher ideas, thought, morality, art, as just byproducts of lower physical stuff like chemistry and mechanics.
So after all these centuries of intense head-to-head debate, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a final and, honestly, a really cool twist in the story.
Get this.
It turns out that this human need to find an ultimate explanation, an absolute, is so powerful, so deeply ingrained, that it creeps back in even in the very philosophies that try their best to deny it. A perfect example is the philosopher Herbert Spencer. This guy was a total champion of science. He wanted to explain the entire world through observable scientific facts. But after he explained everything he possibly could, he concluded that all of reality ultimately rests on something he called the unknowable, an ultimate inaccessible force that science can never, ever penetrate. Sound familiar? It's the absolute, just wearing a lab coat. And this leads us to our final and maybe most profound takeaway. Maybe the true answer isn't metaphysical or materialist. Maybe the most important truth we can find here isn't an answer at all, but the unending, uniquely human, relentless search itself. Perhaps the whole point isn't to find the absolute, but simply to be the kind of creature that can never, ever stop asking the question. So what if you could build a belief system, pretty much from scratch, that actually combines ancient faith with modern science? Well, today, we're diving into one person's really ambitious attempt to do exactly that. We're talking about a faith designed for both the head and the heart. You know, the whole system we're about to unpack really hangs on this one single powerful question. Is it even possible to bring together the spiritual depth of ancient traditions with the cold, hard logic of modern reason? If you've ever felt that pull between those two worlds, you are definitely not alone. And what we're about to explore is one person's really profound answer to that exact problem. And the author tells us right from the get-go, look, this isn't just theology, and it's not just philosophy. He calls it a religious philosophical faith. And that phrase alone, that tells you everything about the ambition here, right? It's an attempt to build a single worldview that can truly satisfy both our need for spiritual meaning and our rational, logical minds. Okay, so if you're going to build an entire belief system, where do you even begin?
Well, according to this thinker, you don't start with rules or stories. No, you start at the very foundation of everything, the definition of God. This first concept, this infinite source, it's the bedrock for everything else that's going to follow. First thing you got to do is forget any image of a person like God sitting on a throne somewhere. This system starts with a principle. Just try to imagine a single, absolute, infinite, and intelligent consciousness. It's not a being in the universe. It is the very source of the universe. It's the ultimate reality that everything else comes from. Now, this is a pretty mind-bending idea, so stick with me. In this view, God isn't some external creator who, built the universe. Instead, God is the moment the infinite universe becomes aware of itself. Just think about that for a second. The consciousness of the entire universe, the unity of everything reflecting on its own existence, that is God. And this brings us to a huge fork in the road, philosophically speaking. Most of us, we grew up with the idea of a transcendent God, a creator who is separate from the world, kind of like an artist is separate from their painting. But this system argues for the exact opposite, an immanent God. The world isn't something God made. The world exists inside of God. And this one concept, immanence, it changes everything. It means creation wasn't about making something out of nothing. It was more like, imagine the infinite deciding to draw a boundary within itself, creating a finite space inside its own infinity. Our entire reality, everything we see, everything we feel and experience, it all exists within that divine self-limitation. Okay, so we've got this picture of a self-aware universe. But where do we fit into all this? This next section, it zooms in from that cosmic scale right down to us. If the world is inside God, then what does that make our little human spark of consciousness?
We all accept that basic rule of physics, right? Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only gets transformed. So here's the logical jump this philosophy makes. What about the energy of your own consciousness, that inner feeling of I? The argument here is that it, too, must be an indestructible force. It can't just be switched off. It can only change its form.
And within that indestructible consciousness, we're working with two distinct powers. Think of them like two different engines. First, you've got reflection. That's our logical, rational mind. It's what lets us learn things and build complex philosophical systems. And then you've got spontaneity, that raw, intuitive, creative spark. It's where art comes from, and as we're about to see, it's also where religion comes from. And this might be the most radical idea in the whole system. What is a revelation? Well, this system claims it is not a message zapped down from a god in the sky. No, it's what happens when human creativity, that spontaneity we just talked about, reaches its absolute peak and gives birth to a whole new religious vision for the world. In other words, it's a product of human genius.
But hold on. If revelation is human, then what are miracles? What are all those visions? This is where the synthesis gets really fascinating. The author uses a scientific term. He calls them hallucinations. But, and this is the important part, they are divinely willed. They're like profound teaching tools, used by the universe to give us crucial truths in the form of powerful stories and images long before our species was ready to understand them with pure rational philosophy.
So we've seen how the individual consciousness works. Now, let's zoom back out again. If each person is on some kind of journey, what about all of humanity, collectively? This final section lays out history not as a series of random, chaotic events, but as a purposeful, grand educational story, a universe that's constantly in progress. According to this philosophy, religious history is basically a planet-wide curriculum. It starts with the raw intuitive power of early pagan beliefs. Then comes a critical leap forward, Judaism, which is called the Elder Brother, introduces and protects this revolutionary idea of a single universal God. From there, Christianity and Islam act as the great preparations, taking that monotheistic seed and planting it all across the globe, which sets the stage for what this thinker believes is the final chapter, a unified, rational faith for all humanity. Now, to make this historical engine run, the author assigns a very specific and unique role to Israel. In this particular framework, they're seen as humanity's religious genius, the elder brother whose main job in history was to protect that core divine law. And the ultimate destiny that's envisioned for them within this system is to eventually serve as a kind of priesthood for that unified global religion of the future. But this idea of progress isn't just about the grand sweep of history. It's also incredibly personal. Remember that indestructible I we were talking about earlier? Well, in this worldview, Each individual soul is also on a continuous journey of growth and development. And it's a journey that doesn't just end when you die.
And that leads us straight to the concept of metempsychosis, which you probably know better as reincarnation. Now, for this thinker, this isn't some mystical fantasy. It's a logical necessity. I mean, if one single life is all we get, how could there possibly be justice in the world? How could a soul truly learn and evolve? So reincarnation is presented as the only mechanism that allows for endless learning and ensures that every single eye eventually gets a fair shot at reaching perfection.
And so, after all that, this entire system leaves us with one final and very personal question. If your core self, your I, is truly indestructible, and if all of humanity is on a long, slow journey toward perfection, then what are you destined to become? On this infinite journey of consciousness, what's your next step?